we'd just like to take a minute to thank you all for inviting us here today to speak about things that Carrie and I love to talk about and do. Carrie and I would like to show you today how creating the underlying structure for spaces is such an essential part of experiencing our gardens and landscapes. They both work hand in hand, no matter what the size or scale of a property or garden. It could be anything from a modest patio to an entire property. On this particular property, we'll start here. The house was in the process of being enlarged when Carrie and I were called in. It's about 2 acres, and much of a wooded buffer between the house and an adjacent golf course had already been cleared so that they could have a big lawn area in the back for their young kids to run around, swim, play ball, etc. So we had to figure out how to arrange a bunch of new elements on the whole property, including this pool, a pond that the clients wanted, and lots of gardens. And of course, privacy. Privacy from the golf course that had just been exposed. You can see in this site plan we did where the pool on the right and the new pond, where the pool's on the left rather, and the new pond on the right are juxtaposed to the house in the rear yard of the property. The big berm, if you look on the upper kind of left of the drawing, you see the word berm and it points to this squiggly that runs around the entire back side of the property. Big berm surrounds the back of the lawn, which in our estimation was a solution to being next to the golf course. Golf course on 2 sides, in the back and on the right side. It would wind up rising up about 4 feet over the level of the large lawn. Between all the new trees and the shrubs that we planted on it, some evergreen, some flowering, and the banks and masses of the roses and other plants both in front of it and behind it, and then adding in a few of the tall existing trees that still remained on the site that hadn't been cleared. I think we wound up doing a pretty decent job of screening out all those golfers. It didn't exactly keep out the golf balls, since what was right across the property line was the practice tee for the course. But what it did was wind up becoming a fun game for the kids and the dogs to gather up all the balls that came onto the lawn. Next, this was the liner that we used to make the pond. The pond was going to be 35 feet wide by 50 feet long. Pretty sizable little pond for backyard, man-made. The liner you see here weighed about 1,500 pounds coming off the truck, and it took 12 of us to unwrap and move it into that big hole. At that time, there were some delays. The trucking was coming from North Carolina. This was back in the early 90s. And by the time the truck and the liner arrived, it just happened to be the hottest day in that early August. The 30 minutes it took us to spread it out on the lawn and move it into the pond, we wound up burning out the entire new lawn that we had just put in underneath it. So that was a reseeding and resodding job that took another couple of months for the lawn to come back. Another story. But next, this is the big hole that pond liner went into. And this is a stream and a waterfall that mimic the pond being fed from a woodland stream, when in fact there's actually nothing behind it but a golf course. The stone wall you see in back there is right at the edge of the property. And we wound up planting evergreens and large azaleas. We transplanted some in front of the wall, moved a few others around, and a couple of small evergreens, and then gardens, so that you really didn't see. It really looked like it was coming out of the woods, and this is what it looked like when it was finished. This shot was taken before the planting and the garden started to fill in. Carrie will talk to you more about them coming right up. Okay.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here. These are the shelves in the pond that I requested from a person that we call Dr. John, who was a machine operator, and we thought of him as a sculptor. And you can see how wonderful the levels are. This is what the pond looked like when it was in and when it was planted. Now, what we used on those shelves at different heights were northern blue flag iris, Iris pseudacaris, the yellow one, pickerel weed, which produces tall purple spikes, and some other plants, as well as water lilies. At the front of the pond, you can see dwarf astilbe and sedges were planted in this part of the pond edge. This is what the pond looked like with the plantings around the edges and border gardens. We used all low things, of course, so you could see the pond. So we put in hostas in the background, and all along Japanese painted ferns, astilbes, dwarf iris, and other short plants, so the pond view was not blocked. This is, of course, the client's dog who is frogging, and we always thought of him as a bonus when we came over because we gave him lots of hugs and he gave us lots of kisses. Originally, we had planted a birch grove here. These are the birches at a very mature size. We've created them in order to reflect in the pond. Many years later, about 20 years or so, the client felt hemmed in by these and asked us to please cut them down, which we did, sadly. Mm-hmm. The result was this garden with winding paths going through. We let it be somewhat wild and do its own self-seeding. So if you wanted self-sowers, use Polemonium, Jacob's Ladder. It's so wonderful that it comes up here and there, and you can get this effect. There are Japanese painted ferns, bleeding hearts, hostas, epimedium, and a lot of other shade lovers that make for this spring tapestry. Mark?
Okay, once we had the pond in, the next thing on this property that we had to tackle was a raised septic field in back of it and in back of the wooded birch grove, which we had just planted. The raised berm around the back of the property had been a result of being next to the golf course. The raised septic field was a result of this area of town not being on the town's sewer system. That, in addition to a very, very high water table and lots of what are best described as little underground rivers, some which we discovered as we dug down a foot, some 2 feet, 4 feet. We went down as far as 8 feet. There was still a lot of water flowing. So we wound up actually having to do a lot of what we call French drains across the middle of the part of the lawn just to evacuate a lot of the water. And the client, it wound up with a bank of septic pumps in their basement, which to this day are still operating, but not as much because as things grew in, the various plantings and everything, they started sucking up more of the water, the birch groves, all sorts of things. But back here at the septic fields at that time, the health codes, and this is the early 90s, mandated this raised septic field. You can see it in the background here, about 2 feet above the lawn. Next.
To break up that feeling of this raised area, in the back of it, we put in grass gardens. And I just want to make a small point here that grass gardens don't only have to be grasses. And here we added monarda to this, a variety called Beauty of Cobham. And we wove it through, and it drew a lot of pollinators to this area. The grasses were Yakushima dwarf, miscanthus. The other miscanthus was Little Fountain, Gracilis, Morning Light, and Zabrinus. So it gave textures. It was the same sort of grassy leaves, but they looked different, and it created a beautiful palette. We also used Pennisetum Carly Rose, which has pale pinkish inflorescences, and Rubrum and Mudri. There were a lot of pollinators here, believe it or not, and we also found that it made such a beautiful statement all the winter long. Another element of structure in the property is, of course, swimming pools being put in. On this particular property, we just didn't want to formalize it because we wanted the plantings to flow and the feeling to be casual. So we opted for this paddock fence, and it worked out very well. These are the gardens at the pool area, and we added them for privacy, and you can see there are a lot of tall plants there. So besides the regular black-eyed Susans, Goldsturm, and the other plants, we also added for height 6 to 7 foot black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia maxima, as well as dinner plate hibiscus. In order to screen the pool from a parking area, we chose a native honeysuckle. Lonicera celosa was planted along the fence, and it was an option that we chose because we really did not want evergreen shrubs as a big block. We wanted it light, we wanted it airy and friendly and beautiful. And one honeysuckle will grow as long as, is it 25 feet or so?
15 to 20.
Oh, 15 to 20 feet, yeah. At the lounging area at the pool, where they put all the sun lounges and so forth, we wanted to echo the colors of the perennial garden at the other side of the pool. So this is an above wall garden. The wall was put in as a 2-foot sitting wall originally, but of course, eventually the plants all crept over the edge and gave it a very soft look.
Next, Teresa. Yeah. We often encompass larger portions of a property with a pool fence, excuse me, enclosure, not just around the smallest area, of the pool. That way it leaves room for the pool to be more open and connect with other elements, and especially entertaining spaces like patios, porches, lawns, and other gardens. A lot of people like that way of opening things up on their property. In the garden you just saw, and this one, which we're looking at now, we chose to keep the pool enclosure right around the pool itself. In this one, we used a black wrought iron fence to create some transparency between the pool and the areas surrounding it. And as you can see, the black-eyed Susans again here, the grasses, which are pennisetums, and the perovskia grow right through the fence and connect the inside of the pool with the outside. The pool fence, though, even though it's transparent and it has the grasses going through it, it's hidden by the grasses to a point which creates privacy for this other patio, extended patio right next to it. So sometimes separating rooms instead of joining them actually works just fine.
Of course, we added more color to things with pots, because the pots are going to bloom all summer long when plants go in and out of bloom. That doesn't mean we didn't add gardens too. Mm-hmm. So these clients liked big and bold. So we used the dwarf versions of the dinner plate hibiscus throughout the gardens. And we added, of course, the edge plants to creep over the wall, which was also another sitting wall. People wish to use that. and we used a lot of the same things repeated in different colors too, so that we got flowing textures throughout the pool. We used rudbeckias and hibiscus and various types of echinacea. On the same property, a lot of big rocks were unearthed during the construction of the house and the patios and so forth. And so I don't like any rocks to go to waste. So what we did was we put in this wonderful rock garden that is seen as you come into the house and the driveway and from various other parts of the property. This is a corporation with a pretty barren hillside. So what we did, and they wanted a view from the windows, from the parking lot, and also from an area they put in the top as a dining area for people from the building. So we brought in all of these rocks and set them into the hillside. First of all, it's erosion control. Second of all, they're nice. And then we planted things that were going to spread, evergreens, many, many varieties of evergreens. They would creep and fill the space in. And this is the result of that. And every once in a while, we would put something a little bit taller and just for nice. And this is a side view of that. And we added roses along the way, all on this rather large corporate property to mimic those gardens and use spireas as well as a factor that brought all of the elements together and repeated.
Sometimes working with rocks starts with just this. And we all have to simply work with what we have. As site designers, we sometimes think around here, who doesn't have a big rocky outcrop that they ask us to plant? Well, this one was kind of an extreme case. First of all, this was a mess. It's on a hillside overlooking, in this case, Norwalk Harbor, and it was a very steep property that had a small house on it, and there were at least 20 feet of elevation difference from the street, from the front of the property to the back. And a lot of it was this rocky hillside. So it got cleaned up and planted. This is underneath that rocky outcrop. And what you see are gold flame spirea, nepeta. With on the right-hand side of the slide, you see smoke tree. There are juniper virginianas, eastern red cedars. And in the front, evergreen skimmia, which is a low hedge, a low evergreen hedge, along with pops of bright yellow Lysimachia creeping along the fissures in the rocks. If you look carefully, you can see them. There was an inch or two of soil here and there, and we started, just putting things in. Next, on the top of the rocks, on the top of that hillside, where there was, again, just an inch or two of soil, sitting on the rocks, we used a mat of liriope, both types, both the big blue, the all green and the variegated, to cover large areas where, as I said, there was only a tiny bit of soil. So what the whole color palette here was chartreuses, lavenders, these varying tones of green, all very, very soft, and then punctuated with this pop of red roses, big knockouts that we planted in a patch where we had a little more soil on the top of the hillside, along with some bright daylilies, which you see on the right. I think they were happy returns. Now, the same property in the front on the street, as I said, it's a small house, but it had a little bit of land all around the front. This was these were front gardens. So in addition to the man-made retaining walls and steps, which we found necessary to create a lot of garden spaces around the house, this one in the front was both shaded and at times it was quite wet. What we're looking at are sedges, the Carex ice ballet, the bright short grasses right along the walkway are Hakanakloa grasses. We also used an acorus called Ogon here. It's just off to the right. And a variety of other plantings. You can see the Astilbes, Ellie, Deutschland. In the background are more of the same spirea gold flames that you just saw underneath the hillside. In back of the tree, which was very shady on the right, are variegated red twig dogwood called ivory halo. They work wonderfully in places like that, especially around trees. They can grow near trees. Okay, next. Now, the garden we just looked at is on top of these steps, all the way in the background. And then there was this big relief, all these long steps on the left side of the house coming down. As I said, it's kind of an extreme example of vertical design, made more so because it all takes place in a very small area around this house. So we added some extra steps to the ones that were there, which lead to a patio right before a small backyard patch of grass, and which is just above the next house down the hill. What we have coming down the steps here in this small place is a river of ferns, different hostas, and good old-fashioned Nico blue hydrangeas, which we love in this place, and it leads you to that patio. We often work with large elevation shifts, but usually in more spread out areas than in that house, in which case retaining and stone walls often do the job quite effectively to navigate from one level to the next. On this property, the entire backyard, just like the last one, dropped away from the house about 20 feet, gradually rolling downward, but over the course of several hundred yards, not 75 feet. So the nearest part of the house was obviously the most important. So that's where we concentrated most of our efforts, designing stairways and terraces. These bring you down from the house down to the pool, which is a simple rectangular shape, and it extends out onto the sloping backyard with a 5-foot stone retaining wall around the deep end. These rustic stone walls and the long, elegant steps, in this case, lead you down to those large lawn areas, which, just continue to drop off. Carrie?
Yes, we have put in a lot of color around the patios. The pool is very, very modern, and we elected to use these beautiful old urns that look very modern, but planted with wonderful and soft things within and around them. So you can see the hydrangeas and so forth. We put, because it's such a huge slope, we put gardens above, but we also put gardens below. Now, so you didn't have to lean over and look at gardens. What we decided to do was put in smoke trees, and these became part of the garden. When you're down on the lawn, it's a beautiful view looking at them from that side as well.
Now, at this residence, the backyard sloped directly away from the house and eventually flattens out into a broad lawn. Not a huge lawn, not like the last one, but, more normally lawn size. The clients here, though, wanted a patio from which they could dine and keep an eye on their 2 young sons. They also, of course, wanted to include gardens. So the solution was to take down that slope and the old retaining wall and build a new stone wall and patio. A pergola was designed and added in the back of the patio over the dining area, attached to the house. And the resulting patio and pergola had steps leading to it from both sides for easy access to different areas of the property, which in turn created room for lots more gardens.
Well, give me a pergola, I will give you wisteria. And this was such a beautiful variety. I found it once and I could never find it again. It was extremely beautiful with large flowers and very fragrant. We planted the wall with climbing hydrangea, and which covered it. We used espaliered euonymus against the house so that it didn't take up a great deal of room. And we began adding the gardens which she wanted. This is one of the gardens leading away from her patio and into the lawn, where beyond there are more gardens. Yes, this is that wisteria. Wish I could find it again. And the beautiful stone walls that Mark put in, and the stairways and pathways to the house.
Okay, on this property, a large and very formal manor house was being built. I worked with the architect and developer not only to site the house, including this formal driveway and parking court you see, but I even designed the formal balustraded stairs and fountain that you see here. After dealing with the front as seen from the street, it was time to begin the more formal landscaping in the rear. The difficulty was that the land at the back, which was fairly narrow, was also sloped toward the house, not away from it. Okay, next. In the middle of that backyard, there was an existing swimming pool, which wasn't in the best of shape. But we figured out a way to rebuild it and extend it from about 30 to 40 feet, all the while creating a series of pretty usable spaces around it, both above it and below it. The ad that you're looking at here appeared, it appeared in this ad from a local stone supplier. And I'm sure, looking at it, all of us would, quote, feel right at home in this place. In the ad, it shows that view of the garden, and in back of it was not the house, but it was this pool house that we designed, and we sited a few steps above the pool. The walkout patio from the house, from the big manor house itself, is on the right. You can just see it behind that dogwood tree, that Kusa dogwood that we planted there. It comes out of the house for about 20 feet. Then it steps gradually up to the pool and the pool house above that. And all of these changes of level, which we had to, build and, really work with molding the land here in this small, narrow space. Above the pool, we designed this formal wall on one side of the pool with this row of scuppers that you see spilling out of it that recirculate the water right back into the pool. All of these changes, these walls, wind up creating different opportunities for plantings, such as this is the other end of the pool. As you can see, this is more formal, areas of roses, plantings, nepeta and such in that large round planter. But it also wound up creating more level spaces on top of the pool and around it for socializing and fundraising. And I believe this particular one was a gathering of some Yale and Harvard alums. Okay. Meadows. Sometimes a wall, stone wall, can be used to bring two very different elements together. In this case, a runoff pond in the front of a house that was being built, and a combination of wet and dry meadow above that pond became part of one another and the front of the house with the help of this 4-foot retaining wall we put in. We planted clusters of river birches, as you see here, and we used a meadow flower mix to create these meadows. Next. That's the meadow, its first or second year in May. And again, a little later with the lupins coming up through it. It makes a very, very nice frame for the house and for the big house in back of it.
Sorry.
Okay, next. A client called us once to tell us that she had made a date with the tennis great Yvonne Lendl. So what she needed was a tennis court now and a viewing patio. No, I'm serious, only in Greenwich, right? A wet meadow sloped away from the house down a very steep hill to a stream. By keeping the slope, but flattening out the bottom of it with a small stone retaining wall, we were able to site the court that she wanted along with the viewing patio. This is the viewing patio and the court in construction. And the gardens were to be planted above and below, well, above the viewing patio, above and below the the small retaining wall that held and rechanneled some of the water.
You know, sometimes things are a little bit of a heartbreaker, because that place where the tennis court went and where this patio went was a wonderful wet meadow where I had seen pheasants and other most wonderful birds nesting and walking. But it's not our call, and I wish it were sometimes, but it isn't. So what we had to do was to divert the underground water, which included a stream, with pipes around the gardens and tennis court, and bring it to a source where it could run into a river. We also worked with absorbing some of the water in the area by planting river birches. And we were able to plant deer-proof and water-tolerant gardens in the middle of this sunny wet meadow. Here we have stilbe, we have Veronica Aclea for spring and summer gardens, iris, daisies, and so forth, you can see. Well, this is the garden that many of you have seen before. It's the Greenwich Close Pocket Park. I designed this park to be by sitting at the dining room table and drawing out blobs and squiggles, which Mark then drew into a proper plan. Mark also designed these wonderful front steps. They're just so easy to navigate, and they look so wonderful. I had wanted a flowery river winding through this entire park. And so these are, you can see the plans of the pathways. The garden with the little stepping stones in the middle of it was turned into a proper butterfly garden. And we wanted this park to be an ecological park, but we also wanted to have favorites that people would love. Why not? So of course we put in many, many dozens of varieties of iris and peonies throughout. And here's the park. It's such a lush piece of property, as you all know. And walking through, there are truly hundreds of varieties of plants. Most of them are very insect, butterfly friendly. We even have a family of rabbits living in there. And since this natural lawn, the rabbits might nibble a couple of plants, but they have ample clover and other weeds that they like to eat. And this is a patio where we wanted to surround it so that it was a comfortable and cozy place to sit. Now, this is an English lattice fence that is not made of wood. And so it's easy to clean and it's very good. But you see that strip of green going down? Well, we're lucky enough that the Parks Department of Greenwich, along with the Greenwich Tree Conservancy, of which Mark is a founder, is donating cherry and hawthorn trees all along this green strip.
So, continuing with pathways, sometimes the structure of pathways can lead to unexpected results. Here in this slide, this is New York City. Carrie and I took a 7,000 square foot flat rooftop just above street level, in which a luxury condominium was being built. And we laid out a series of winding pathways, which created a dozen or so separate islands and perimeter spaces. This was all part of a deal that we had worked out. Carrie and a group of green people, agencies, including the Trust for Public Land. We brought all of the local legislators in, and this whole public-private mix, a community garden on a private luxury condominium space became the first of several urban precedents that were used to do the similar things and that we worked with later. This was in the early 1980s. We did this. The islands that you see created in this space then became further divided into 30 or so different gardens, each planted and developed by an individual community gardener. That's what I mean by the unexpected results. Next. It's what the garden looked like just a year or two after things got planted and filled in. And Carrie and I ran it for the first 10 years or so. It's very much considered a New York City treasure. It's accessed through a locked gate, since it's on private land. And there are thousands and thousands of keys that are sold to local residents and businesses, which is partly what helps keep the garden funded.
When we first laid out this garden, we went to nurseries and thought what we could use for structure in the garden to begin. And then the gardeners could come in and take their plots and do whatever they wished. So actually, the first thing that we planted was a peach tree. And this is that peach tree 35 years later. And it's ailing now, and they are trying very, very hard to save it. A lot of tree experts are working on it. And what it did was start an annual peach tree festival where there were so many peaches on this tree. And they were picked, and people brought the jams, the jellies, the pies, the tarts, and everything they made out of peaches to the garden to share with each other. It's a wonderful community resource. And even after all these years, there are still some of the original gardeners there working. You can see the view of New York apartment buildings here, and actually across the street, not the red one, but next over, is an apartment that Mark and I lived in so many years ago.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I did a lot of gardens on this property, a lot of them. And the client said that what they wanted to do was have their morning coffee on a little patio in the front of their house. So I called Mark to come in, and Mark designed this wonderful cozy space for them. And the walkway, he redid the walkway as well, and the steps, and really turned it into exactly what they wanted, a very comfortable spot to sit.
On this old property, this house was built in 1930. We were called in and we constructed these short stone walls and paths, the serpentine wall that you see in front, and all these pathways that were used to create a very peaceful environment for the owners to arrive home to. Now, you see on the next slide the actual plan that we came up with for this space. The houses off to the right and down below. This shows the front courtyard, And it's in a very small space, a very formal courtyard. And the reason for that is because the owners entertained both private and personally and for business. And they needed a place where they could erect tents for fundraising functions. You can see in this plan where the dotted outlines show where these specifically sized tents were taken up and put down and taken up and put down so many times, like every month or two, that we designed the retaining walls to handle those tents. And we actually put in permanent tank anchors in the corners in the ground so that they could just go up and be taken down at the snap of a finger. And of course, while we were doing this, we had to watch out what was going to be underneath the tent, the tents, what were going to be outside the tents. But we were always careful to maintain the feeling and the scale of that cottage that it was modeled after. Next. And around the other side, the back side of those front, this is still looking out from the front yard. Okay, there were other built elements like this gate and a millstone that we found on site. And the view here leads to a very, very nice view of Long Island Sound. You can see how close to the water this house is. It's literally, we had to work with tides sometimes to go back and work in certain areas. Okay, switching materials. Sometimes creating new opportunities for gardens can be accomplished more easily by switching materials. To give an example, the most common occurrence of what I'm talking about has to do with those very inelegant wooden decks and clumsy steep staircases, very often left behind by so many builders and developers. I'm sure we've all experienced those. We get called in a lot to look at them. People say, this doesn't feel good. We feel disconnected from our backyard, from our property. What can we do? These are the decks that tend to separate people from their yards instead of connecting them. Okay, next. This deck, it's really not a bad one at all, but we're going to use it as an example. It's a little too small to be very useful, though. It overlooked a very narrow rear yard with what appeared to be an inhospitable slope draining down, right down onto that yard. Next. That's the backyard. This slope covered with ivy and pachysandra coming down. You can see it goes way, way up. Not the best feeling. The deck itself didn't relate to either the ground or the other elements of the house, such as where these French doors walked out onto this tiny lawn area. And the lawn was always a little sparse due to the amount of shadiness in the area. So by switching from the wood, taking the deck down, switching from wood to stone, in this case, fieldstone walls and bluestone patio floors, we were able to create a bi-level patio which knit all these areas together. And also expanded the apparent width of the space from this narrow corridor to this. Same space, different materials. The new spaces we created allowed us to plant gardens and that hillside as well. We cut back into that hillside with retaining walls a couple of feet. We changed the narrow space into a very attractive, which helped us change it into a very attractive space. Next. These are shade gardens. We made put in some steps going up that hillside. So this hillside actually became usable for the owners. And we created the opportunities, as I said, for these nice little shade gardens, hostas, stilbes, ferns, Okay.
Something that we'd like to end with is something that is very, very dear to our heart. It was a first project that Mark and I worked on together. Mark drew me into the project because he was asked by the Dean of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine to do a prototype model of a bioshelter wherein food could be grown in cities. So this is what part of the cathedral close turned into, these wonderful gardens. I designed the gardens as on the right side, you can see the circular arms were the menorah. The left side is herb gardens, and those were in the shape of the Tibetan Kala chakra. And the central path was the Celtic cross. The vegetables and things that grew, we'll go to the next slide. It was such a wonderful garden. It produced so much food that we were able to supply the soup kitchen at the cathedral, as well as give food to neighborhood people who also came and worked in the gardens. Many of them came from places that were agricultural. They were living in a city, and this meant a great deal to them to just be able to work in the earth. Okay. So what this garden was the first thing that we did together, and I just wanted it to be in the show and show it to you. Okay, next.
Gotta go back.
Where do you want me to go?
Okay, sometimes we start with something like this. We start with a property that we've worked on. Trucks have run over the land and have created huge ruts and masses and so forth. And this, where there's very high water table, turned into this mush. Actually, if you look at this picture, you see a weeping cherry tree that's there. I actually warned every trucker to be very, very careful of this, because this was a very important tree on the property, and they were very wonderful about it. It became our protected tree. So this area, we wanted to put in, believe it or not, a vegetable garden. This is the plan that Mark laid out for the veggie garden. And this is the construction of that garden. And there it is. It became such a wonderful thing. And Mark and I found that more and more and more clients were asking us for these wonderful organic vegetable gardens, which we love doing.
Excuse me. So we're still with vegetable gardens here. There are a lot of different elements that help structure a garden. As you just saw in the last slide, most of the vegetable gardens we build have the raised beds about 6 or 8, sometimes 10 inches above grade. Occasionally, we have reason to do larger beds. This is one of those such things. This garden is at the Bartlett Arboretum in Stamford. And I want to talk to you about a couple of different elements that help the structure a garden. We've seen elevation, we've seen rocks, we've seen stone, we've seen how pathways work, we see how patios mixing and matching different materials, and we've seen how fences work to help create the background and structure for gardens. In this particular garden, this again, I'm used to working with sketches. The director of the Bartlett Arboretum handed me this sketch with all these squiggles on it, just like Carrie. Okay. Everybody hands me sketches with squiggles and said, "Can you do this?" And I said, "I don't know." But I figured out a way to actually make a garden out of those squiggles, keeping the squiggles and all the curves instead of straight lines and squares, which are much easier to build. The wood and the stone that you see here combine to create the garden that you see. But there's something else mostly unseen and unnoticed by the public. The soil itself. We used, when constructing this garden, different layers of different densities of topsoil, clay and rock, to mirror the best of nature's own designs beneath the beds as we were constructing them. Did I mention that the slope that this garden was built on, the garden is about 75 feet long, and the lawn it was built over sloped down about 4 feet. But the garden had to be level because it's designed to be handicapped accessible for wheelchairs. So we had to create this platform and level it all off and make it in a way that the soil supported all of what we were building above it. So next, you see here the lowest level that we created this platform on for these gardens. We use these things called tailings, which is a mix of subsoil and lots of rock chippings. They're considered garbage or expendable by most excavators and even nurseries, but they are absolutely essential to create good drainage and structure when you need it. If you don't layer things like this, and this has happened to many people, when they're leveling places of their property off, somebody comes in, puts all this great soil down, and then what you wind up with is the next spring is mush. It's very soft. This helps create the solidity underneath that is found in nature itself. Next. And after doing that, after that lower foundation is created, this is the top level, what we like to see. It's the lightest combo of topsoil and compost. The compost made from leaf mold, manure. This is what you want to plant in, but it's only about 8 or 12 inches deep. And if it doesn't have the right stuff underneath it, as I said, it can turn into a gooey mess. Next. The pavers that you see here are laid over that same mixture of tailings, but then with a layer of gravel over it too. And we have this big garden with these big beds. The beds are like 10 feet wide by 12, 15, 16, 17 feet long, all in these circles that I said I figured out how to build this. We did this out of cedar, tongue and groove, 1x6 and 1x4 panels, which we could put together and bend into these vertically into all these round shapes. So when all this was done, this is the first year of that garden. A nice, very healthy combination of herbs, vegetables, and other perennials. They're oriented into each of these 6 or 7 different beds. They were designed, each bed was designed to relate to one of the 5 senses. That's why it's called a sensory garden. It's a teaching, an educational garden. Sight is one bed, touch, smell, sound, and taste. Each bed has plants that relate to those senses. And you can see it if you go over to the Bartlett Arboretum. It's been there. This is its 2nd year now.
This is actually our vegetable garden here at Acorn Cottage. Along the right side is a vernal stream. So this is the time of year when that stream bubbles. Otherwise, it's a dry stream bed. You can see we've planted along at that. And this is that stream bed when it's running. we've done plantings, but the forget-me-nots had taken over this garden, and it was really quite lovely. We also use our vegetable garden for putting in tulips for cutting for the house. And you can see the fence. It's kind of old and starting to go, so it's been replaced by a new and wonderful paddock fence, which lets in a lot more life. This is the perennial border along that fence. And just to give you a little look, sort of beauty inside the fence with our vegetables, beauty outside, all possible because of the underlying structure of our gardens, and Mark's very good eye for that. Thank you all so very much for being here and for asking us to speak. We very much appreciate it. Mark?
Thank you.